Have you been?
Yeah, I guess I've been good. Yeah, I mean I think a lot of like non I mean like creative things are good, personal life things are good. The lack of teaching work in the summer is rough. But everything else is feeling pretty good. So that's nice. Like I walk out onto the street in the morning and I see the trees on like 10th Street or whatever and I'm like, yeah. So
Yeah,
it's
sure.
feeling grateful for that, definitely.
Even amidst our heat wave.
Well, that definitely puts a damper on things, but you know, still things to be feeling good about. So yeah, basically good. How are you?
Good. Yeah, basically, didn't really do much last week. I was on vacation, but I have since we last met, got myself max MSP. I'm on the free trial.
Nice.
And basically doing a lot of like patching stuff and additive synth stuff and watching some tutorials here and there, but mostly been focusing on just like playing around and getting a feel for everything, looking up different videos as far as like how to do different things and whatnot in the same way that I was with pure data.
Yeah.
So per your recommendation, I'm sort of drifting away from the pure data stuff and just looking into the max MSP stuff, and it's been an interesting little gander so far. I
Cool.
have also been doing. I haven't purchased any books or like read anything too far in depth as far as your recommendations from our previous meeting. However, I have done some research on some of the stuff that you recommended to me, like the Boulez caged correspondence stuff. And
Oh yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
yeah, looking into that, and it's obviously the intrigue is there to read this entire piece of exchanges between two major composers of their time or artists of their time, and understanding the how both come from two different worlds, but ultimately, like as far as like the role of chance and music is concerned, how they both dance with that and then diverged away from that. Just getting a broad synopsis of that, and then
Oh
just
yeah.
diving in and learning a bit more about the two outside of just 433 and all that.
Oh yeah.
It's been interesting for sure, and something that I would like to dive into at some point. And then just looking into like constructivism and materialism stuff and just understanding a bit more, in a bit more technical terms or academic terms, how the two are distinguished from one another.
Oh
One
yeah.
thing that I did have a quick question about was just the idea of objectiveness as a characteristic of constructivism and how, what it means to say, like focus on the intrinsic properties of music itself instead of like external or programmatic stuff. Like what exactly is meant by
Mm.
music in this instance?
Oh man, what a good question. Wow. Okay, we're just in it. Wow. Cool. Yeah, this was fun to talk about. Okay. Well, so we're talking about focusing on the sort of like innate also, okay, wait. So time period wise, could you tell me like for the stuff that you've been reading, what time period they're talking about? Because the discourse changes a lot over time. So
Oh,
if it's sort of just kind of the original ideas of either like, I mean, the original sort of like capital C, like constructivist movement was like Russian constructivism, which I only know a little bit about and it was mostly in sculpture, I think. But then a lot of the ideas that sort of came from constructivism got like that word kind of got ported over to music for a lot of the sort of like, especially sort of like Boulesian serial stuff. So we just kind of mean generally constructivism in music as being about assembling pieces of assembling pieces of music through sounds that have all of these different parameters like serialism, like the duration, the sound, the dynamic of the sound, all of that, and trying to like construct something that way. I guess that's what tends to come to mind for sort of constructivism in music. I feel like I'm using the term a little bit loosely, kind of from like a historic perspective. But yeah, I think I have an answer to what you're asking, and I just want to make sure, like, is what I'm talking about making sense or sounding like we're talking about the same thing?
yeah, yeah.
Okay, cool.
I just have my notes, so it
Okay.
kind of
Right.
from
And I,
places.
yeah.
It's not
Okay.
necessarily, yeah, but
Yeah. And I need to send you, I'm sorry, I didn't send you the last lecture. I've got to do that too, or the last conversation. At least I don't think I sent that to you. But yeah, so sorry about that, but I will
Right.
if it's not already in the chat. Okay, so okay, so sort of focusing on the sounds, sort of like innate properties, as opposed to, you said sort of it's like programmatic character. So there's an interesting transition that happened through the 20th century. And another book about this I'll mention. Honestly, I wouldn't recommend it as highly as I would recommend the other ones for the type of thinking that you're doing. But there is a book that is a long read that helps with this. It's called The Rest is Noise by Alex Ross, and it walks you through kind of the 20th century in music. It's like kind of a book for people who like reading long books about history. And it spends a lot of time on things that I think are not that important for what you're trying to do. So I don't recommend it extremely highly. Like, it's a good book, but there are faster ways there. But it does give you an overview of the 20th century. So it's just, this is like a reference point that exists. It's a pretty conservative, or like a populist perspective on the 20th century. And Alex Ross knows his stuff, but that's kind of the book. So anyway, that's just like, I'm just mentioning that. But there's this thing that's happening at the beginning of the 20th century, which is like people are getting away from classical and romantic period ideas about form, and the idea of writing programmatic music seems to be a way to get away from things like a sonata or like a theme and variations. It like lets people create forms that are in some way related to what they're trying to do with the music. And then we also see things in like literature and stuff that are like like modernist literature, which is kind of like, I feel like something like James Joyce is like 40 years ahead of music in terms of what he's doing with like technique and stuff like that. So then by Boulez and Cage and stuff like that, there's this sense that still like writing a piece about like a lake where there's these sort of like shimmery orchestral sounds to describe like the light reflecting off the water, and then there's like a melody that's like about how the composer feels about the lake. It's like, although that's a break from that stuff, had been a break from like a sonata form or something, it's still like kind of like wishy-washy, and so the idea of like, let's really focus on the materials at that time through constructivism, or through like what Boulez was doing for a while that was called total serialism, was really about being able to work with one note at a time, um, or work with one sound at a time, sort of like for itself, and sort of like, quote, for its intrinsic properties. I'm putting this stuff in quotes because I've got other stuff to say about this, but I want to just get to this point first. And so a lot of Boulez is kind of like, and this is a simplification, but it's kind of like these two composers, Webern plus Debussy, where Webern was very kind of like, he didn't write that much music in his mature period, and they're all really short, but he really was able to justify every decision. And so all of the pieces are kind of like, there isn't much that's like subjective or like emotional about them. It's like subjective in the romantic sense of like, the wind makes me want to write this soaring melody, which is like a very specific type of subjective, So Webern strips all of that away, but Webern's forms are very simple. And then Debussy is still kind of in this like, this song is called The Sunken Cathedral, and here is the beautiful melody. He's still in that zone, but his forms are very dreamlike and strange. And so Boulez gets the weird, hyper detailed, very sort of impersonal sounds of Webern plus the crazy forms of Debussy, and starts to find something. And what he does with total serialism is that like, he's working with tone rows. So do you know what a tone row is? Okay, so I'm gonna talk about this stuff because where I want to get you, and where I want to start a lot of what I really have to say, is like one step beyond this. So I'm just gonna mention this stuff so that you know about it, because like, this is it, on one hand, it's really important stuff to know for understanding, I think, like what I would call rigorous kind of like art music making in the contemporary period. But all of this stuff, all of these conversations also really ended a long time ago, and a lot of other stuff happened. So so basically, that's just kind of my macro context for what we're talking about. Okay, so tone row. A tone row was something that came from this composer Arnold Schoenberg, who was another major kind of, another major early 20th century composer. And Schoenberg invented like atonal music, basically. And the idea of the tone row is that you repeat each note, each chromatic note, or each chromatic pitch before you repeat the first one. So you have a row that's like every note in the chromatic scale. And yeah, and so basically it's like before you can play C, you have to play all the other notes. You can play them in any order, like, or, you know, the tone row is the order of the notes. So you might have, like, for example, C, E flat, E, D flat, A flat, A, B, B flat. How many notes is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. D, G, F, F sharp. What is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Okay, cool. So I'm just going to drop that in our chat. So like this would be an example of a tone row. And so that means that you would write a melody. And now this is old school. This is like circa 1914. But you write a melody where you have to play all of those notes before you can play C again. And so the effect is that you are no longer in an obvious key. And for where music's at now, this is not a new idea or a particularly progressive idea. But what it allowed Schoenberg to do, who was feeling very trapped by like romantic music, which is just like more and more chords that have names, is to sort of like emancipate melody from the idea of key, and even emancipate harmony from the idea of being in a key or having chords that have names and functions, like a 5 chord, a 4 chord, you know, a 2 chord. And so basically, in a tone row, you can actually get sort of like a tone like matrix, or from a tone row, where basically what you do is that after this tone row, well, you can write the whole tone row again, but where every note is moved up 1/2 step. And so you have like C sharp, E natural, F, D natural, A, B flat, and so on. Like, does that make sense with the tone row that I wrote?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And so so you can do 12 of those. So
Okay.
that, yeah. And then where it really becomes a matrix is that you have, if I'm remembering all of this right, 'cause it's been 9 years maybe now, 10 or 7, 8 years, something like that. Basically, rather than writing it like C, C sharp, D, what you do is you write the tone row both this way and this way. And then, if I'm remembering properly, then you write out the so we'd have like C, and then here we'd also have E flat, you know, because we have C, E flat, we'd also have C, E flat, and then you write out the version of this tone row that starts on E flat. So you just raise everything by a minor third. And so what you get are all these different all these different like manipulations of this tone row, which I think is something like 12 times 12. It's like 144 different combinations. And so the effect of that is that it like gives you like a shit ton of notes to pick from. And so you can work without thinking about tonality, but having tons of options, like a really big palette. And so then, following Schoenberg, this became a big thing. Like, he was like a major, it's like one of the two most important, probably like most important composers from 1900 to 1945. It's probably like Schoenberg and Stravinsky. And they're very different. And it's kind of like choose one or the other, kind of. A lot of other stuff happens. Boulez has a teacher named Messaien. Oh, I misspelled that. There we go. I think I get the order of letters mixed up. And what Messaien starts to do is do things where each pitch also has like a duration that is fixed. So he'll say, or he'd write out scales of durations. So he'd be like, this sort of rhythm melody or this rhythm scale or something. It's been a while since I've thought about this. Is like it's like a rhythm pattern basically. That's like dotted quarter note, triplet, 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 quarter note, half note, 16th note or something. And so that's like a rhythmic personality that's like free floating. It's just a group of rhythms and you can assign it to any pitch. But it's a group of rhythms which exists independently of our ideas about melody. And so rather than the melody having the rhythms that it has, because that's how a composer heard it, they're getting into, this is where it starts to get actually constructivist, and that they're like, we're going to build something from these raw materials. So we have this like sequence of durations of notes. And then maybe you can, rather than just having it this way, you can also do it retrograde. So you can do it, play the whole scale backwards of rhythms, you know, or you can start on like unit 3. And so then you loop around at the beginning, you know? And so basically what we're doing is building a language of pitch options that are not, that are not coming from anywhere other than from themselves. And so what Boulez does is he takes this world of like both sequence of pitches, tone rows, and sequences of durations. And then he also creates other parameters for sound. So he'll create like a row of dynamics. And dynamics in classical music are written down, and so like forte is loud, piano's quiet. You have like mezzo piano, which means like a little bit quiet. Mezzo forte, a little bit loud. Or you have fortissimo, which is like double loud. You can write 4 Fs, you know, and it's like extremely loud. So you can do all of that stuff. And so Boulez would like write a scale of not of durations, of dynamics. So it'd be like MP, P, MF, P, PP. Like if we can just get over the, yeah, PP, FF, MF. And then you have a scale of that. And so now he's got all these different objects that are floating around. So he's got a bunch of arbitrary sequences of notes, a bunch of arbitrary sequences of durations, and a bunch of arbitrary sequences of dynamics. And then sometimes he'll even have like sequences of like attack qualities or like timbre qualities. So one will be like accented, you know, or it might be like staccato, or it could be like you can't do this for piano, but like a sort of like staccato tenuto, where you have like a flash and then it sustains, like bum, you know. So there's like big attack and then a little gradient, or like little sustain. And so then he writes a few pieces that are called structures. Structures 1A is one of them, in which he says later that if he could have written the piece with a computer, he would. It's just this, is just these rules, and it creates a piece. Let's listen to it for a second. And there's a video of Boulez and this pianist. Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Okay. Now we're like bussing it down. Senior year composition seminar style. If you can watch a video that's on Facebook, this is just where it came up. But it's like a video of Boulez and Yvonne Loriod practicing this piece. And to kind of just for more of the community context, this pianist Yvonne Loriod, I'm mispronouncing her name probably, was the composer Messaien's wife. And she was this concert pianist. And so it's like, it's so much this group of people that it's like Messaien's student, Boulez, playing this crazy piece with Messaien's wife. So it's like they're all really close and having these conversations about music and stuff. Yeah, and so I'll just let you like listen to this for a second.
Yeah, let me
Or actually, I can do a screen share if you want, because I've got it pulled up.
Okay, yeah, that's fine.
Okay, cool.
I'm usually bad with like getting the Zoom to use volume.
Yeah, it's all good. Okay.
Yeah, I can't hear anything.
Oh no, really? Oh, I've got to share original sound. Stop share. Okay, I'm gonna fix this. Advanced sharing options. Okay, it's not there. Say share, and we're gonna say share sound. Cool. Yeah, thanks for that. Okay.
Cool.
Can you hear it now?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, and so this is like a rehearsal video. So like when they're actually playing it, it'll go a little bit faster. It sounds a little bit more intense. But you can kind of hear it's these groups of chords and durations and as much difference in sort of attack quality as like a piano can provide, which is pretty limited because you're basically pressing a key, so you can do it hard or soft. And then there are the dynamics. And so this piece is like, I don't think it's like a crowning achievement of well, okay, cool. Yeah, this is good. I'm glad we're recording this. Okay, so this isn't like necessarily like an aesthetic achievement on like all music ever, right? Like this isn't like a masterpiece, although it's historically important because it's a piece that's so completely like what it is. But it's kind of about what it opens in terms of like doors. So this piece creates the basis for Boulez's creative practice, or like for basically all the rest of his music that he wrote for the rest of his life. In that this opens up a new palette where sort of the like quote unquote subjective qualities of sort of romantic music, where it's like it's there because I feel it, like it's there because it's in the wind, this sort of like very sort of like idea of humans as emotional and music about like expressing emotions is totally removed. Not really as sort of like a people shouldn't feel emotions thing, but because those ideas were at that point limiting the development of the possibilities of music.
Mhm.
And so by focusing on tools that are this like sparse and this restrained, he sort of opens the door to another possible world of like sound. And I mean, I have a lot of complicated feelings about Boulez, and like for me, a lot of the last 5 years, my practice has really been kind of like fighting against a lot of the influence of him because he was so what I had a European teacher with very like who was like really like the post-war avant-garde composers were the good music and things have been downhill since there. Like this is the good music. And he was still, I mean, my teacher was like a very kind of like left-leaning person, but it was like this sort of like post-war modernism is the correct leftism kind of like political view. Like sort of like Adorno was very much in the conversation, which is like in a specific sort of like left-leaning political aesthetics and like
Yeah.
politics view. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so this piece, I think it's really useful to think of it as a point in time where it opened doors. But there are a lot of issues with this piece. And actually, the composer Georgi Ligeti, do you know Ligeti?
I don't think I've seen that name before. No.
Okay, yeah, no. Ligeti's if Boulez was somebody that I had to fight against, Ligeti was kind of like one of my boys or something. I was really into Ligeti. So Ligeti wrote a lot of music that was used without his permission in 2001: A Space Odyssey. So
Okay.
the really weird, dissonant, intense stuff in 2001 is usually Ligeti. Um, so Ligeti's issue with Structures 1A is that for one thing, the way that Boulez maps out all the durations, it's mostly very short sounds. And that's just because like the sequence of durations that Boulez wrote was like mostly short sounds. And so like, for example, if you have 8 possible durations and 5 of them are less than a quarter note, like then you mostly have short sounds. And even if you get one whole note every now and then, you almost never get notes moving against each other. Just because like it's not like a weighted scale. And also when we're talking about all this stuff, have you heard of the word stochastics?
No.
Okay, so stochastics, I'm jumping all over the place, but I think that's just the way to do it. So
Oh,
stochastics are something it's like an important topic in mathematics around this time and a little bit later. It's kind of like probability, or it's like using the laws of probability to try to figure out chaotic systems or figure out systems where you can't exactly predict how something's going to go, but you can predict pretty much how it's going to go. So you can't build like a one-to-one map, but you can build a loose outline that will follow the general shape of something. And so basically stochastics in music mean setting up some system of probabilities where like let's say that you have a random number generator, and if you get one, if the random number like and the random number generator will give you between 1 and 5, and 1 is a quarter note, and if you get 5 it means 5 beats, so like a whole note tied to a quarter note, like, and it's like you can get a very simple stochastic rhythm by going hit the button 2, you write a half note, 3, write a dotted half note, 1, write a quarter note, 1, you write another quarter note. 5, you write a whole note tied to a quarter note, you know. And so it's a very, very simple way of using random number generation to create a sound or to create a sequence. So I'm throwing out like a ton of information right now, but I feel like you're pretty ready for it, and like welcome to the magic that is the post-war avant-garde. Because like
Yeah,
yeah,
it's a
like
lot of like throwing stuff, and then I'll parse it apart later.
yeah, totally. And I'll send this to you. Yeah, and like it's really cool to learn about this, and also nothing like this has ever happened again. So like it's like kind of like enjoy like the feeling of discovery now, even if it's kind of overwhelming, because all of this stops between 1965 and 1970. And
Hmm.
this was this unbelievable period of discovery, sort of like 1950 to 1970 in this music that stopped. Um, Pretty much because it happened. Like there, where to go after this was unclear, and it's still unclear in contemporary classical music, I think. But anyway, so it's like it's limited, and I've talked to other people about that where they're like, I thought I was going to keep learning about cool music, but at a certain point, I'm just like still listening to the same John Cage pieces. That was like a friend who, yeah, like said that to me recently, and I'm like, I kind of know what you mean. But then also we get pop music after this and like production, and that's kind of what shows up. Anyway, okay, so now I'm way off topic. Okay, so stochastics, in other words, basically in music, stochastics are like writing music with random number generators. That's pretty much what it is. Um, there's more to it than that, in that different people have taken it very far, but that's pretty much what it is. I'd also say stochastic music is very similar or the same as algorithmic music. Um, Maybe those terms are associated with different people, but it's pretty much it's like you set up a set of rules that will generate something, you know?
Hmm.
And this is a lot of this happened before. Oh, sorry, my phone's buzzing. I've got to move my phone off this table so I don't get distracted. Or maybe I'm imagining it. Nope, I just hallucinated that. Okay. Well, yeah. So,
If you need to take a call
oh
or anything,
no, nope, there's no call. I just felt my table buzzing and I didn't know why. It was super weird.
okay.
Um, okay, so stochastic music is this pretty much the same as algorithmic music. Okay, so how does this have to do with John Cage, or not John Cage, Pierre Boulez? So Boulez writes Structures 1A. He says later that if he could have written it with a computer, he would. And one of Ligoty's critiques of this, there's an essay somewhere that Ligoty wrote that you can probably dredge up through Google. It's very, very technical and is is worth reading if you're really passionate about this, but otherwise I can give you the summary, which is really all that you need, which is that like because of the way that Boulez set up all of his like his like scales of durations and stuff, it created a very specific perceptual experience, which is kind of like pointillism. It's kind of like ba ba bum do ba you know, it's like it kind of sounds like that. And Boulez's idea was very lofty, you know, and like actually was totally, I think, implemented. But the way that he set up all of his rules for generating this music gave him a very specific sound that has a very specific perceptual effect on us. Like, for example, like what does it make you feel, for example, to like listen to that sort of pointillistic music, maybe in an emotional way? Maybe what are your associations? You know, like how much can you ignore the fact that you're hearing a piano? You know, like how much can you ignore the details of the sonorities that you're getting, that he's getting through all of this just sort of tone row stuff, and just hear it as like a combination of like numbers, you know? And so from this like sort of, we could call it sort of constructivist. We can also call it structuralist, constructivist slash structuralist. And I'm being kind of loose with these terms, but as far as I remember and as far as I know, a lot of the musicians were being useful with these terms, because the truth is that music was not where any of this discourse started. So all of these terms, constructivism started in sculpture, structuralism started in like anthropology and became a big like philosophy thing around this time. So musicians are kind of just grabbing terms that sound smart. And like Boulez is actually like really, really, really smart. Like he was like extremely wide read and very, very intellectually rigorous. But for the most part, applying these terms to music is much looser than applying them to like philosophy or something where like all these terms have very specific meanings. But anyway, whether it's structuralism or constructivism, this thing that Boulez does, although it's very pristine in terms of doing what he sets out to do, carries with it this other thing, which is that the sound is a very specific sound. And he's really not taking the sound into account. And so this kind of peak of like musical modernism kind of like also sows the seeds for like a lot of things that recognize that potential shortcoming. And maybe it's not a shortcoming, but maybe it is. And so a lot of people take it in very different ways. And so this comes back to like when you're asking about removing the subjective elements, or like you didn't, I don't think you said this, but like removing the emotional elements of the music or something. It's like, what does it mean to remove that and claim that you're putting forth like putting forth something that is like objective, you know? Because like at the time, that was a huge step forward, and it opened the door to many, many, many different types of avant-garde music. Like it was this sort of like, I mean, there were other deep things that were going on at the same time, and it's difficult, like the whole like, I mean, there were issues with like sort of like the great man theory of history or whatever. But it was also a very small number of people who mostly lived in Paris who were thinking about this stuff. And so it is kind of, it's like kind of like so few people that you can point to individual people, because it was like so niche at the time, and now it seems like a big deal in hindsight, but it was really like 10 people having conversations, you know? So maybe this wasn't the first piece that was doing it, but I think it, at least it's lived in history as being that. So Structures does all these incredible things. It has a lot of shortcomings. Different composers take it in very different ways, including like Ligeti, who wrote this critique. Ligeti wrote a lot of music that's still very like, it's, I guess you could say it's dissonant. It's a lot of music with these chords that last for a long time, which is kind of the opposite of this sort of like pointillism. But it's still music that's been sort of freed from all of the, from what becomes a prison, which is the romantic idea of melody, ideas about tonality. Like, and those things aren't prisons if you don't feel imprisoned by them. But they are prisons if you are trying to do something else and you don't have the tools to help you get out of it, you know? So basically just by liberating all the parameters of sound in this way, it opens the door to all these different things. There was like musique concrète that started around this time. So there were people who were doing similar things with actual like field recordings. And so that was kind of responding to the question of like, why a piano? And I could be getting the timeline wrong here. Like the musique concrète stuff could have come before this, but it's like, if you can't get over the fact that ultimately, no matter what you're doing with durations, you're hearing a piano, you know, like, which doesn't seem like a problem Boulez ever had. And he's also like, he loves classical music, and he went on to be a conductor. He loved classical music and went on to be a conductor. But some people were like, I can't forget the fact that I'm listening to orchestral instruments. So they get into musique concrète. And then there's another idea in there that's very of this time. So it was cool at the time, and it's been critiqued a lot in hindsight, which is this idea of like the it's like reduced listening, which is I believe, what's his name? I'm thinking of the wrong person. Pierre Schaeffer. Okay, so in musique concrète, they talk about like reduced listening, which is like listening to a sound and trying to perceive its inherent internal properties without thinking about its cultural references. And so there's the example where Pierre Schaeffer records a piece that's like an etude for a train or something like that. And it's a bunch of recordings of a train. And his idea is that if you just listen to the train for the sound and you don't think about the fact that it's a train, you can discover all of this stuff about sound, which is pretty profound. And like Americans did kind of similar things, but often with a very different kind of philosophical outlook and with very different like artistic goals. So this is pretty close to like somebody like Pauline Oliveros, if you know Pauline Oliveros. And I have a lot of thoughts on the whole like European versus American thing here. And I think it's very easy as an American to neglect the European stuff. And I think philosophically, I feel more aligned with the American thing. But the truth is that European musicians just had so much more technique. It's like there's no question like that. It's like if you really want to learn about how people are working with sound and are being really, really good at it, and like every second is like worked out very intentionally. Even though I might disagree with some of the philosophical ideas that are more European about art, and I like the Americans more. Like if you are comparing like Pierre Schaeffer and like Pauline Oliveros, like Pauline's like a very exciting thinker, but her technique is just not comparable. And this isn't like a diss, like Pauline just didn't care about technique very much. And a lot of Americans at this time really just didn't care about technique. But like the European technique thing is like, if you're interested in it, it's so worth getting. It's like life-changing as a music maker. And like most Americans don't have that. Um, and like that. So anyway, that's another conversation. But so we get basically reduced listening. So some people are like, these sounds are too short. Like, what if you want to listen to the sounds for a long time, which is like Ligeti. Or Schaefer's like, this sounds like a piano. Why can't it be a train? You know? And so there's this whole explosion of what's called modernism in music. And modernism's like a big, like it really describes like a 50 to 60, 70-year period, but it's still kind of in that framework. But throughout all of this, there are a few really, really big problems that, and this part will connect to things that you're probably already aware of because you're, you know, like an intellectually engaged person. But like, for one thing, trying to ignore the associations that a sound carries with it is, some people would say it's problematic, you know, like some people would say that this is like perpetuating the European tradition of like, you know, and all the issues with the European tradition. Other people would just say that you're limiting yourself if you're not engaging with like memory associated with timbre, you know. Almost all Another issue is that almost all of this music neglects the body. And this is also in this very sort of like post World War II suspicion of emotion, you know, because the idea was that like emotional music leads to Hitler, basically. It's kind of like a reaction to like Brahms, or not Brahms, but like Wagner, you know, which is just peak like feelings and like losing yourself in the feelings. But the concern at that time was that like if you lose yourself in an experience, that's like how fascism creeps in. And so they were all very against that, to the point that like writing a periodic rhythm, if you have a sound that's like doom 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 doom, you know, like you better watch out. Like that was forbidden. And a lot of these people, or people who were successors to them, like think techno is like idiotic and fascistic. So basically we get a very, very contentious perspective, which led to some good stuff, but also completely misses the boat on pretty much everything that happens in most music that most people know about after like 1963. Like, because like as soon as the Beatles come around, things change a lot. And a lot of people who really still participate in this late modernist strain of music don't consider any of that to be related to what they're doing. And so like I left that world intentionally. And so I feel like ignoring all this stuff, ignoring the effect of music on the body, ignoring the effect that like a timbre can have on engaging a memory, it's a little bit like burying your head in the sand and hoping for something that's not going to happen, you know, which are also kind of critiques in art of what's called like late modernism. And so I just mentioned all of this because this was this incredible explosion of music. And like I wrote music that like I went through this thing where I wrote tone rows and I wrote atonal music, and then I got into ligety and I felt liberated, you know, like from the issues that I was having with this. And then I got into like drone music and just intonation, and like that actually kind of made me like a pariah at NEC because people thought that I was an idiot for not writing like Boulez, which was really funny, and like backwards, because all of these were debates that happened like many years ago, you know. But so basically, yeah, so basically by the time that you get things like post-structuralism, like you get Derrida, you know, or you get like Deleuze, or you get Foucault, and of those, I mean, like, I've really only read Deleuze. I feel like people could say that what I'm doing has stuff to do with Derrida, but um, I'm not, I don't, I'm not that engaged with it. Basically, you get all these people who are critiquing this sort of like straitjacket that was created in French philosophy from 1945 to 1965, which is also like structuralism, you know? And so then you also get like like feminist thinkers who really have to deal with the body because like the body is like something that's very heavily policed by a lot of these sort of like left-leaning but still primarily like male thinkers who don't have to deal with realities of the body in the way that a lot of like female people have to deal with realities of the body. None of this deals with alterity, like none of this deals with like race. Like this is a lot of like well-meaning leftist sort of like socialist white people arguing about the details of whether you can write notes that have a pulse or not, you know? So like uh and I mean I think they were functionally like not like I mean I don't think these people were necessarily like explicitly like racist or anything like that. Like I think that in the grand scheme of things they were definitely making an effort to be on like the right side of history. Um but I think they were so concerned with the tradition of Western art music that like, you know, like things outside of that, it just wasn't clear how to relate what they were doing to anything else. Um, and I think they also felt very removed from like popular music or like music that had any sort of like commercial vector, because there is this sort of like Adorno era like Marxism where like, you know, like the like recordings are bad, or like if you only hear part of a song on the radio, that's like a crime against art, you know, is like a big like Adorno thing. Um, and they were all pretty much aligned with that as far as I know. And so basically all the issues that you could have with Adorno, you can have with a lot of this music. And so I just mentioned that because it's like all this stuff is really, I mean, it's incredible music that really changed the development of music, but it also ended at a certain point for a reason. And so when we talk about objectivity versus subjectivity, you can write out an objective group of tones and you can write out an objective scale of durations, you know, and make something. Um, but in order to hear it that way, you kind of have to ignore a lot of what your ears and your body is telling you, you know? And those people were very afraid of what their ears and body would tell them because at those times the thought was like, all that stuff leads to fascism. And so like, yeah. And so to connect this to things that we've talked about, I mean, Cage is already coming from a different place because Cage is really seriously dealing with like Zen Buddhism and he's seriously reading about sort of like Hindu thinking and stuff like that. So he's really approaching non-Western stuff a lot more seriously. And also more broadly, a lot of Americans at the time were trying to create like an American conception of art that breaks from Europe. And technique is a big part of this. Like I mentioned, Americans don't have technique, but it's also because like Americans didn't want technique or they didn't want European technique. So you've got like Jackson Pollock, like making the drip paintings, for example. Or he's British, but like you have Keith Rowe turning the guitar sideways because he's influenced by Pollock and he wants to get away from any past way of playing the guitar. Or you have Cage not writing anything down and just listening to like rain, because the original performance of 433, it turns out, was during a rainstorm, which is like not something that people talk about, but is such like an incredible detail. There's like sitting in a barn listening to rain, you know? And also the degree to which all of this is psychological, where like I had a friend who was like very deep into Cage and was like reading the John Cage Merce Cunningham correspondences. And it was becoming pretty clear that in the case of Cage, there was this pretty intense sort of like pray the gay away thing going on with him for a while, where he was trying to remove himself from the music, and there was probably some shame about his like sexuality going on there. Um, which is funny because it's like on one hand it's really hard to write that into a history book, and it doesn't diminish the quality of like or his contribution to music, but it's also a really, you know, and also if there were something psychological like that going on now, it would be like a conceptual art thing that would actually probably go over really well. But at the time, because there was this interest in like material for their own sake, material for its own sake, experience for its own sake, that probably at the time would have made it seem like less serious or something. But like all these people were humans, so that's also stuff to take into account. It's like and also I think the degree to which they're people actually it influences their music so much. Like Ligeti was like a very silly person, and you can really hear it in the music. And like Boulez was pretentious. So anyway, so there's a lot more going on. And at a certain point, you have minimalism, which is kind of one of the things that I wanted to get to. And this is the core critique of minimalism, really, of like when like Lamont Young starts off as like a prankster. But like the first piece that really feels like a Lamont Young piece that I know of, or like a mature Lamont, or actual, not like early career Lamont Young, where he'll like write a piece that's like, you know, like push a piano until you can no longer push a piano, and it's just like somebody pushing a piano against a wall until they collapse, for
Right.
example. Or there's like a piece where he tells Terry Riley to like climb into a piano and just kind of roll around for a while and kick and stuff. And it's all like written with all these weird typos, and it's like it reads like a Tim and Eric sketch or something. Um, but the first Lamont Young piece that really feels like a Lamont Young piece is called Composition. I believe it's Composition 1960, number 7. And it's funny how fast all of this advances, because Structures 1A is 1963 and Composition 1960 number 7 is 1960. And I guess Andy Warhol and the Velvet Underground are like 1962 or 3 or 4 or something like that. So like within 10 years, this thing has this gigantic life. You've got Stockhausen writing pieces for 3 orchestras. Like it gets so complicated. And then already between Cage and Lamont Young, you have a very intense break. And so Composition 1960 number 7 it's like a score that can fit on the back of like a postcard. And it's just a perfect fifth. It's B and F sharp around middle C. And it says like mezzo forte or something. And it says to be played for a long time. So after all of this stuff, it's just like hold a perfect fifth for a long time, which is almost a joke. Maybe it was a joke at first, but it's so the opposite of Boulez, you know? And beyond its prank quality, which it might have been, Lamont Young has a hit, like kind of, I mean, he's really into his own mythology and he'll make things make sense in hindsight, but that's kind of what we all do. But it's like, so with him, there's kind of like an extra layer of needing to like sort out what he thought at the time and what's like him building a story of himself as like a great American artist, which is, I mean, I think that's like I think it's fine for artists to do that. But it is a thing. Like he totally understands the core sort of prerogative of Structures 1A, or even if he didn't know that piece, he understands Webern at least, and Structures 1A has a lot, it owes a lot to Webern. So the music is totally liberated from all the past ideas of, you know, how music needs to unfold, programmatic ideas, romantic ideas, literary ideas, anything. And it's just a perfect fifth. But the drama that Lamont Young finds in the music has to do with all the things that are forbidden from Structures 1A, which are like the effect of the sound on the body, the details of the sound itself. It's not just you hear the sound as a combination of points on a grid or whatever, or of possible combinations, but you have to listen to the interval of a perfect fifth. He also leaves the instrumentation open. And so that means that he's not like sort of relegating the music to a piano. And so he's avoiding the composerly approach to like making an artistic statement about timbre and the effect of timbre on memory by saying it can be any instrument. And so, for example, if it's played on a violin, you still hear it on a violin, but the violinness of the sound, the associations with like the centuries of the European concert hall or whatever, are not within the composer's definition of the piece. And so, although it's still there maybe for you like as a listener, it's sort of bounded off from the composer's intentions, you know? And the other thing that actually happens, this book that I mentioned about Lamont Young last time, maybe I told you about this piece a little bit, but it's like the author sees like a 6-hour performance of this piece for like a small ensemble or something, and there's a double bass player who's playing the perfect fifth, and holding that perfect fifth on a double bass for like 6 hours is brutal. And so what starts to happen is that his fingers will move a little bit, and the perfect fifth will slightly fall out of tune because of the reality of the performer trying to make the sound. And what happens if you listen to two sounds for a long time, if they're these perfect just intervals, is that they sound a certain way, right? Like with like beating patterns and all of these other things, they sound really in tune. And if everybody's playing really a perfect fifth, like a 2 to 3 relationship in a harmonic series, then it creates all these like additional frequencies and stuff, right? But if that falls out of tune at all, the psychoacoustic effect changes tremendously. And so the effect of hearing this piece for 6 hours was hearing the perfect fifth itself, and then also hearing whatever happens when the humans who were involved in playing it begin to sort of reveal their bodies, or reveal their humanity, or reveal their bodies' limitations. Because then the sort of like what we can call, or what Radulescu calls like the harmonic aureole, meaning all the bright harmonic sounds that you can hear above the pitches that are actually being played. If you listen for many hours, you'll start to hear like changes in all of that stuff that just come from humans not being able to sustain exactly the right note, you know? Or if it's a double bass, you'll hear the bowing change, and then there's a rhythm that's created. And none of those things are specified, but all of those things are made visible through this direction, you know? Um, and so the piece just it even though it seems like a sort of a joke, and it doesn't really take any old school composerly technique to write that, you know, 'cause you're just writing a perfect fifth. What it actually does in terms of like what it reveals and what it makes possible and how it critiques structures 1A, but it understands structures 1A is yeah, it opens up a lot. So that's kind of my like that's my speech about a lot of that stuff. And then I mean it really expands. You can hear I mean the whole history of what I think is like good minimalism or like rigorous minimalism or like serious minimalism is a kind of continuation of people having tremendous sensitivity for the rigor of the artists that they're influenced by and finding the rules that they can break to introduce something which is like ecstatic and beautiful and new but contains the feeling of rigor still.
Mm.
Yeah. And so yeah, and so like do you know Eliane Radigue? Have I told you about Eliane Radigue?
Yeah, she's like one of the, well, I know her, I think independently. She's like one of
Oh
the
cool, yeah.
main like electronic
Yeah.
composers.
Totally. Yeah, yeah. And I think her goals with electronic music are very different than a lot of other people's. Because like she uses synthesizers, but I think really I think of her more as like a drone minimalist than like an electronic musician, even though it's technically electronic, but the goals of her artistic practice are much more aligned with drone minimalism than with like music concrete. And I mean, she came out of the music concrete studios, but what people in music concrete are trying to do just has nothing to do with her like artistic goals, you know? Um, and so she has this one piece, for example, called like the Resonant Isle, to translate it into English. And it's the last electronic piece that she made. And it's like I'll type it into the chat.
I got it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, yeah. That I mean all of her music, at least from like 1970 onward, 1973 onward, like I mean she just keeps getting better as she gets going. Really from like 1975 to 2000 or 2000 onward is just like unbelievable. And it's cool that it took her a long time to make the stuff that feels like mature works. There's a lot of stuff from before she got like really, really, really good. And it's still good music, but like when she really gets it, it's like some of the best music. Like I've just been obsessed with it for 5 years, and I think it's for the rest of my life. But with Lille Resonant, it's like 8 minutes of just like synthesizers that are barely changing, and there are beating patterns, and it's super neutral, and like it's so like inexpressive. To put that in air quotes because it has that's not really the right way to think about it, you know? It's like but it is inexpressive. It's very, very like static, and the effect of it is that it not lulls, but it puts you into like a meditative state where you're just there with the sound. You're not expecting it to change. And then you find a lot of things that you can love about all the beating patterns and the timbres and stuff, but you have to go into them. Like they're not going to impress themselves on you, which is incredible. And also very different than Boulez, where, you know, Boulez is pretty much telling you what he thinks. This music is like music that like invites you into its world. And then after like 8 minutes, there's this sort of loop of like this sort of like women's like Renaissance or medieval chorus or something. I don't know what the origin of it is. I think it's a sample, and it's like stunningly beautiful, and it's the human voice. And there's some other electronic stuff that's happening in the background that sounds almost like a major chord, and that happens for like 15 minutes. And then it's another like 20-25 minutes of just like very, very inexpressive synthesizers, you know?
Mhm.
And so what it really is like still following all of the durational rigor of somebody like Monte Young, but it's asking this question of like, what if you put this thing that signifies, like, it's not a very, like, I mean, a synthesizer that's unchanging still signifies something, but not in the same way that like the sounds of like a medieval choir signify, you know? like in terms of just like the intensity of the associations that it carries. So she's just like got this big chunk of time. What happens if I break the big rule? And the big rule, one of the big rules of modernism is like no signification, because as soon as you reintroduce signification, you either get post-structuralism or postmodernism. So it's like her. I think it lives on as late modernism because of how much she follows the spirit of modernism while breaking with the rules of modernism, you know? But it is she breaks the big rule, which is no signification. And she just like sticks it here and you just have to deal with it. And then there's another like 25 minutes of like incredible, barely changing synthesizers that are making these incredible and very subtle beating patterns, you know? And so that's just another example of like breaking rules knowingly. And I'm gonna like cut this lecture essay on minimalism off because it's not like there's like it's not the only thing we can talk about. But the thing that I was realizing about music for 18 musicians, which is like another piece that I've been listening to for years and years and years, like probably thousands of times by now, is that the way that it starts, which is a pulse, it's like a quarter note pulse on a major triad, is like such a middle finger to modernism and the post-war avant-garde. It's just like dot 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 dot, and pretty quickly it becomes this piece of music that's really great. And Steve Reich actually has like unbelievable old school composer technique in a way that a lot of Americans don't, and that's because he went to Juilliard where they teach that stuff. But like it's just funny because that it's such a confrontational beginning to somebody who knows about the whole sort of like modernist music discourse, and it sounds like such an inoffensive beginning to anybody who doesn't know that discourse. It's really funny how either extremely confrontational or like completely not anything it is, you know? Like I just think that's a really funny it's kind of a, I don't know if it's genius because that like it's something you can arrive at by thinking. It's not like a burst of something where you don't know where it came from. But it's really, to me, that's like one of the funniest almost jokes in the history of music because I've suffered through it and like felt like an idiot for not wanting to write music like Boulez, you know, like, and then I hear him who also he went through that and he was trying to write tone rows and stuff and it wasn't working and he was like, okay, I've got to do something else, like because he just didn't like it. And he had another teacher. His teacher's name was Barrio, Luciano Barrio, who I'll write that name in the chat too, so we've got it. Who was just like another one of those post-war avant-garde composers. And he was studying with Barrio when he was doing his master's degree at Mills. And at a certain point, Barrio was like, you know, if you don't want to write atonal music, you don't have to write atonal music. Which was a big thing because at the time, actually, in American academia, you were only supposed to write atonal music. So that was like a big thing. And this is why Steve Reich didn't go on to stay in academia and like started a moving company and all that stuff. But like that was like his way out, was like Barrio saying like you don't have to do that. And it's funny mapping all these to specific people instead of like societal forces. But in this time, it was like a really small world. And I've definitely also had experiences where teachers have given me permission and it's changed my life. And it's really weird. It's like the last time that I had a teacher give me permission, it was like December of this year. Like it's really, because it's like if somebody that you really respect who knows a lot more than you is like, don't worry about that rule. It's like, but you care about this discourse of modernism and stuff. I think actually a teacher being like, don't worry about that can really make a difference. Just because it's a music that's kind of made by a very small number of people and they pretty much all know each other, you know? So yeah, okay. So that's a lot of stuff in answer to that question. And that is like an hour. But like it's I feel like I might have just saved you. I mean, if I had been able to tell myself this when I was 24, I would have saved like 5 years of feeling confused. You know?
Yeah, sure.
So like, yeah. Because like none of those people can account for Jimi Hendrix. And like that's a problem, you know?
Right.
Um, yeah.
Well,
So
that's one of the things that I wanted to ask. Like, I hate bringing stuff back to like Radiohead, but like when the whole like Messian and like Igor Stravinsky and stuff, like those are some of Johnny Greenwood's biggest influences. Like, I've always tried listening to some of their pieces and been like, okay, yeah, this is great, like on its own, but I don't really identify the connection between this and music that may be more contemporarily familiar to me.
yeah.
And I'm like, and it's sort of makes sense in some way, like in the way that you outline, like, okay, you're giving yourself a certain set of rules and limitations to work off of, and maybe it's from that angle more than anything else. But I'm curious if you
Yeah,
identify their influence in music today, in a broader sense, or even in a more granular sense than that.
totally. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so I have a lot of feelings about this because but I think anybody who had the teachers and spent the years that I did on learning about this stuff, not just me, and I'm not the person who knows the most about it by any means, but anybody who's been through that process will almost definitely know significantly more about all of this than anybody who's appearing in a music magazine as a rock musician. And the reason for it is that they're two radically different life paths. And the things that you need to do to get accepted to a PhD program as a composer, the things that you need to do to get a song like Creep on the radio, are just completely different. And so, like, for example, like Tom York like doesn't know music theory and like works by ear, and Johnny Greenwood like knows music theory and like can get the deeper, like get the more like needing to know the details from a theory perspective. And but like, so a critique of Johnny Greenwood's like film scoring that I don't care about, I think it's accurate but I don't think it matters. Some people think it matters a lot, is like, oh, like Johnny Greenwood's like voice leading is bad, or like, oh, like Johnny Greenwood is like copying Penderecki, but like Penderecki was a big deal like 70 years ago. And I'm kind of like, this sounds like people who are like in academia, and like didn't get to be like, they're like why is this person who's famous getting to do the stuff that's a big deal? Like, I know more about counterpoint. It's like that's not wrong, but that just doesn't get to the core of what's going on. And so like, yeah, it's like I don't think that Johnny Greenwood has personally lived through the aesthetic crises of modern music, um, because he did a different thing with his life. And so he might, I think where it really comes from is that he's a fan and he knows some stuff about the inside of a lot of that music from like a harmony perspective, you know? And I think the way that he's influenced by it is very sort of technically direct. And this is part of why, like, if you really listen to Radiohead and like what's going on, especially in terms of like harmony, it doesn't really sound like any other rock band, you know? And like when I listen to the harmonies that are going on in a lot of Radiohead's music, they're almost like they're not quite like found objects, but it's like or like what's the Duchamp word for like a ready-made? Like if you have like a Radiohead bass line that's like referencing new wave music and like dub or like can or something, they really love it. So it's not just like a random object that they found, but it's almost this sort of like historical shard of something that they picked up. But
Yeah.
then but like the way that they're dealing with it in terms of harmony is not the way that Can would have dealt with it. Like the way I think in Radiohead, it's really the way that they move through pitches, the way that like chords will unfold, which is like super, where I think wherever Johnny Greenwood's like got his finger on it, it's very old school composerly. And by old school composerly, I mean like really knowing harmony inside and out, and really believing that the essence to like good music, or even in a like, if I were to be harsher on like that approach, which is, I mean, I have a fair amount of that technique. I have about as much technique as you could have from that stuff while still having the beliefs that I have, I think. But it's like the idea that good music or serious music or smart music has to do with how sort of intellectually rigorously and like subtly you can do things like voice lead or create transitions in orchestration. It's like, and that is kind of the sauce. Like if you're like making scores, that's the stuff where you just like lose your mind and it's like really satisfying. And like a lot of the best notated pieces that are fully notated are incredible with all that stuff, because like when you're really composing capital C and you're in there like writing all those notes, that's like what your brain is doing. And I mentioned I feel kind of harsh about it because if I'm saying like serious or like smart, when like by that standard, Lamont Young's an idiot. Like composition 1960 number 7 is nothing, you know, and yet I just had all this stuff to say about it. So it's like, and so that's where the old school technique kind of falls short. And it's both. It's like, and so I think Radiohead, like, they have all of this old school technique with harmony because Johnny Greenwood just like knows so much about it. But Johnny Greenwood's also got really, really good like taste. in like a, you know, like playing music by ear and like kind of really knowing, almost like in like taking a bite of a dish and appreciating the details of the spices way, you know, like he gets a certain guitar tone and it's like, hell yeah, you know? And so with Radiohead, I kind of see it as like I think the influence of something like the Beatles is actually pretty understated in this case. Because with the Beatles, it's like if you have like a day in the life or something like that, like you have the songwriterly stuff that's like, oh, it's the Beatles, and then there's this like serious music. Like there's like the influence of like Stockhausen on like the Sgt. Pepper's cover, or like there's like the musique concrète stuff that will happen, or there's like the orchestra playing crazy dissonant sounds, you know, and it's sort of like pop plus art music. Um, and they're held to be a little bit separate, you know, and they're ultimately the result is pop music, but it's pop music that's influenced by art music. Um, and so in the case of Radiohead, still it's like pop music, but it's got like the sort of the both the flavor of like uber hipster like perfect taste in terms of like the whole history of like alternative music, plus high budgets, which is a rare combo, plus like that old school composerly like love for harmony where you have to take each chord as its own perceptual thing, and like none of the chords sound canned because the person who's writing the chords is understanding every note and leading one note to the next note like so well, you know? And they're all kind of there, and it's really special how I think how they all kind of coexist. Um, I think the biggest difference between like and if this isn't like I don't think this is pretentious because it's actually something that I've really been like kind of dealing with Radiohead in the last year, which is why I have so much to say about it right now. But the difference between Radiohead and somebody like me, besides the fact that I'm one person and I'm not a band, and like what a band can do is very different than what one person can do, even if the one person has a studio, you know, is that like because in Radiohead the personalities can kind of like smash up against each other, not in the sense of arguing, but in the sense of like Tom York's doing his thing and Johnny Greenwood's like, let me write a bunch of stuff from the octatonic scale in here too. You know, it's like all the things can kind of exist less as like a single thing and more as like a quilt or something, you know? And because the band is so good, you don't really perceive it as a quilt unless you start trying to pick apart why are they doing that? Why are they doing that? Besides like because it sounds good. But I think if you're picking it apart from sort of like a conceptual art perspective, not as in concept album or like what the band says the concept is, but but like from this like Eliane Radigue sticking a choral sample into the middle of this drone thing, that more sort of like conceptual, like post-structuralist thinking where you're paying attention to the effect of all of the poetic and durational resonances like on your like existent or like on your consciousness and on your memory and stuff like that. To me, I do perceive them as being a little bit separate, in the sense of different people in a band, but it's also because they're literally a rock band and they were friends in high school, you know. Whereas I think rather than the sort of like from many one patchwork, which is a really sick patchwork, I think the way that I write, which is the way that I still hold on to sort of the modernist impulse, which is like I think about it pretty much all the time. Like if I'm doing laundry or cooking, this is pretty much what I'm thinking about. Like I just like live with it. It's like painful and confusing and also leads to good art. Is like I need a kernel of an idea that justifies every decision that I make in accordance with that core idea. And this means writing music, this means writing songs takes forever for me because I can't make decisions arbitrarily. Or when I do, I will need to like revise them so that they make sense with the big idea that I find along the way. And so for me, drawing on like Penderecki or drawing on Messaien or whatever in this way where I'm just gonna scoop some up and then like have my friend do some cool stuff with it, that doesn't work for what my artistic goals are. Um, and so I think the way that I'm dealing with all of it is less like, and some of this because it's cool. Although there's some like, I mean, there's appreciating the hipsterness of it, but it's like I need to find a reason for working with the semiotic or like with the world of association, and that includes technique. And I think I've developed as a result of this, and also as a result of not having mentors who really think this way, because most musicians don't think this way. Like it's yeah, I'm really figuring it out for myself. I was gonna say something about mentors because like if I could talk to people who had already been through this, it probably would be a lot faster. But and so I think I just need to like talk to some 75-year-old sculptors or something, because that's like the people who lived through this in like visual art, where people think about this stuff a lot more than in music.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, it's basically like I need like I need to have a reason for dealing with reference and memory in the way that I am in every timbre that I'm working with, which is a very inconvenient way to be as a songwriter. And it means like I'm not gonna be an Adrian Lenker who can put out like 2 albums of songs a year because like I just it takes me too long to make decisions, you know. So that's another thing that I'm struggling with all the time. And so I just mentioned this because like my perspective is it's led to the practice that I have, which is a very difficult practice. Like, and I've eked it out over years of like struggling. Um, but the only reason I think that I wouldn't recommend working the way that I work to anybody else. And the only reason that I do it is because I don't think there's an authentic way for me to write music at this point other than what I'm doing. And like if I'm looking for it and I'm experimenting with process and I'm trying to find a way out. Um, and this is also kind of one of the almost like trauma things of participating in late modernism is that you're going to be looking for a way out kind of for the rest of your life. Or you just have to forget the magic that you're hearing that you don't hear in music that doesn't have this sort of this thing, this core thing, you know? And so it's like, it's tough because I honestly, I talk to a lot of composers that I respect who are like friends of mine now who don't have this thing. And there are things in their music that I don't hear that I want to hear, but I don't hear. And that makes me feel a little distance from what they're doing. But they're also just free in a way that I'm not free. So anyway, this is just kind of like the psychological effects of going through this stuff in an era that really just has nothing to do with it and doesn't support it at all, you know?
Yeah.
Um, anyway, this is a very, very long rant about a couple of topics, but like trying to give you the real stuff, you know?
No, no, I definitely appreciate it. There's so much to take from your last answer. And also to some of the points that you're making earlier, like, yeah, when I used to watch Zizek videos all the time, he used to talk about Wagner and how like music can easily devolve into fascism and Hitlerite sentiments and stuff like that. So it definitely reminded me of that. Yeah, all this is like really great stuff, and I appreciate the additional references that you offered me to dig my teeth into.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah, it's really satisfying to talk about this stuff. It's like definitely what I've got.
So,
Or, you
so
know, yeah.
I guess not to drag this on for much longer, but so what you were saying at the beginning of your response to me about Johnny Greenwood and all that
Hmm.
is that ultimately, and correct me if I'm wrong in interpreting it this way, but ultimately merely um, appreciating these composers for their utility as like these subjects that you could transpose into your own, into, you know, regular music, to for lack of
Yeah.
language.
I
That
think
that
yeah.
comes with a lot more limitations than what meets the eye, I guess, if that would be a correct interpretation of that.
Yeah, but I mean, I think there are also only limitations if you see them as being limitations. And I think a lot of academic composers have a very different perspective and also have a lot more technique than really any other compose. Like, I mean, academia is where you go if you just want unlimited technique and almost no influence, you know? Like, so from that perspective, it's a shortcoming. But I think maybe another way to put it is that he sort of mixes it into what he's doing in the way that almost like a fan would. You know, like like he's a fan of that music in the way that he's like a fan of, I don't know, like the Smiths or something, you know, like maybe not, I don't know if Johnny Greenwood specifically into the Smiths, but you know, like music from that time and place where like you learn how it works and then you kind of learn some of it and then it kind of shows up in your playing and you hear the influence and you're like, yeah, you know, it's like,
Yeah.
it's like that. It's like rather than working through the individual composers' sorts of like aesthetic projects and their points of brilliance and shortcoming, and then following up on their project and the core sort of philosophical thrust of what they're doing, but like through different means, you know, which is kind of the progress of like fine art. Generally speaking, I think it's more like he's just like sounds sick. Like let me work some of that into what I'm doing, you know. So yeah, I guess that's pretty much what you're saying.
So with someone with the familiarity with those composers, someone like you, what exactly is the point of critique with that? Is that it like that, like just referencing music in that sense reveals its own blind spots, or
Well, I think it has to do with the place. This is really great to talk about. Because I don't get to talk about this stuff very often. That's what I think about all the time. I think it
well,
reveals. Oh,
not to
yeah.
cut you off, but the reason why I'm so curious is like yeah, I've definitely looked up like um Arvo Pärer, like Tintinnabuli, like how to do that on guitar, just for the sake of coming up with like some
Right.
cool melody to play on guitar rather than actually getting into the whole theory and stuff like that. And so I'm sure that Johnny Greenwood isn't the only person to do, but I'm just curious to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, totally. I think it comes down the reason that I recognize that it can be a critique, but I'm not that bothered by it as a critique, is that I sit in a weird place among people who know about this stuff and have the sort of background that I do, which is that I grew up listening to records and teaching myself to play guitar and being a fan of music first, like being a fan before I was like a student and writing songs imitating people that I liked and thinking that was pretty much what I wanted to do. Um, and I don't have any like pretentious idea, or I mean, I have a lot of ideas, but I don't like I really have a lot of respect for like high art, and the way that it unfolds really is sort of like one axiom following another axiom, which is then made form through the materials the artist is working with, whether it's, I don't know, in music or something else. Um, and that really the core thrust of like the core of the music is really what it's about. And then the surface is like a sort of rediscovering all of the things that make that medium joyous or make that medium beautiful, but seen through this new perspective that nobody's ever seen before, which is like, I think generally the task of like fine artists, including composers. Um, and that's very different than something like what maybe we could call like low art or like design or like low culture or whatever, where the core question isn't really about that. It's like, how well does it exist in society? Like, do people like it? Does it sell records? You know, things like that. Um, which is a very different consideration. And if it does those things, then by the standards of most of the people that make it, it's a success. And those questions of rigor that make high art what it is, are not of concern to people who are doing this sort of more like design. Like if you're a designer, you can copy people and it's not a problem, you know, like you can use a font, you know, um, because it has a function. Or most rock bands can copy other rock bands because the point is they're a rock band and they want to play songs and play shows. And it's not really about every tiny decision that they make saying something profound about the whole history of music, you know? So they're different lifestyles and different creative paths. And I like a lot of commercial music. And by commercial music, I just mean music that's there to satisfy people because they like it, instead of music that is fundamentally about constructing a new statement about what the medium can be, you know? And trying to be in this sort of in between place that I'm in and trying to do it in a serious way is like next to impossible, because the only way to do it is to do it in the most rigorous way possible, and everybody who goes through it has to do it in a different way in response to the time that they're coming up in. And so like what worked for John Zorn won't work for me, you know, because I'm just literally a different person who's lived in a different time. And if I'm copying John Zorn, then I'm a person who's copying John Zorn, you know, like I'm not John Zorn, I'm like a John Zorn fan, which is like a different thing.